Okay, Kev, teach us quick.
Me, yours truly. Okay, so continue the theme with davening. So if one has to travel and leave very early, before the time that's allowed to actually start davening, because you can't just daven at like 2 a.m. when it's pitch dark, because it's like nighttime. So what it says here, if one anticipates that while traveling he will not be able to daven properly during the optimum time, that is Shmona Esrei after sunrise, and before Sof Zman Shema, which means the last time for saying Shema, then he may daven before sunrise. In this situation, there are two options. One, he should start davening brochas and Pesukah de Zimra, but without Talis Tefillin, which a lot of shuls do in South Africa, with sufficient time to reach Yishtabach at the time of Kedai Sheyakir. Whatever that means, that's probably the time, that's the allowable time that you can wear Talis and Tefillin. If he recites brochas before Alot HaShachar, which I think is daybreak. Damon, is that right? Alot HaShachar.
Yeah.
I think that's daybreak. Okay. He should preferably postpone the brocha. Okay, I have an saying vina until after the davening. Okay, let's continue. After Yishbach, he should put on his talis and tefillin, reciting the appropriate brochas, and continue with the brochas of Kriyat Shema and Shmona Esrei. This is the preferred method, as it satisfies the opinion that the bracha of Yotzeir Or should be recited, which Or is light, should be recited after Kedai Sheyakir. If one needs to leave very early, and therefore cannot wait until Kedai Sheyakir, which is obviously the time that you can do certain things or put talis and tefillin on, start with the brachas of Kriyat Shema, and then put on talis and tefillin without the appropriate brachas. Start the morning brachas and Pesukah de Zimra. Okay, I think this is a bit too complicated. I think for something like that, okay, then you can say the Shema, but it's, even though you're saying it earlier, you can only say the Shema at a certain time. You have to repeat the Shema, because the Shema can only be recited after Kedai HaSheyakir. So, okay, that's actually a good point to end this on. You can start davening earlier, but you only get credited for saying the morning Shema at a certain time. So, if one starts davening much earlier than daybreak, you're actually not fulfilling the mitzvah of saying the morning Shema. It's still nighttime. It's probably a machlokas.
How do you put on tefillin or do tzitzit where your last bracha vayomer Hashem al Moshe lemor, where you're doing all the tzitzit, when you can't discern between?
It said after Yishtabach, but you have to get to Yishtabach.
Correct.
But there's the Shema. But while you look, if you reach daybreak with tefillin and talis on, you're wearing it, but you've said the bracha before.
That's my problem.
But the Shema, you don't get you have to say it again at the designated.
On A4, so the Gemara in 58b, if you remember, recorded an incident in which somebody cut down another person's palm tree. So the exile ark required the damager to pay the full worth of the tree. That Rav Nachman assessed the payment as a deduction from the value of 60 such trees with their land. So the Gemara wants to know, well, basically at the end of the day, which halacha do we follow? So Rav Papa and Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yeshua, ruled in an actual case in accordance with Rav Nachman, evaluating the damaged tree in relation to 60 of its kind. So the Gemara quotes a different version of the ruling. Another version, Rav Papa and Rav Rahuna, the son of Rav Yeshua, evaluated a palm tree with a small parcel of land. So when they say a small parcel of land, they're saying the same thing. In other words, land that holds 60 trees. So since the Gemara doesn't even say otherwise, it appears that that is the unit of evaluation mentioned here, 60 trees. So that's used as the same as the first version. except in the first version it states specifically 60 such trees. In the second one, a small parcel of land containing 60 trees. So we don't go according to the exile arc. But when we look at the halacha, and the halacha follows Rav Papa and Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yeshua, in the case of an Aramean palm tree. So that's 1 in 60. But the halacha follows the exile arc in the case of a Persian palm tree. So I just don't want you to girls to make that mistake and think that if the case was held in Persia, you hold by Persian law. That's not the reason. The reason is a Persian palm is different to an Aramean palm. Persian palm is extremely valuable, and it warrants an independent assessment. That's according to Rashi and the Rosh. So Ravad explains that since it's usually sold independently of the ground, it should be also evaluated in that manner. In other words, you might buy it as a single tree, so then you get evaluated on a single tree, not in a larger context because of the price and the fact that it's usually sold separately, like batteries on a toy. Okay, so Arthur, are you okay? You look like you're glaring at something. Can you see me?
No, I just when I put my phone down, it looks I'm on mute. When I put my phone down, it looks like I'm sleeping. When I bring it up, you see my eyes.
Well, it did look like that a little bit, but I thought
when I go there, it looks like I'm sleeping. But when I go down,
yeah, it did look like that. I just didn't want to say that in the share, but thank you for bringing that up.
No, the only problem is I got to hold the phone up like in the air instead of putting it down.
You don't have to. Just relax, but just as long as you're listening. I don't care what people think. What we're discussing here is there's a slightly different narrative that's going to go. It says that if you require a 1 in 60 evaluation, Eliezer the younger, it's now bringing a completely different case. And it's saying, listen, it's bringing a story in, which is a nice break for you guys, so you don't have to concentrate as much. So Eliezer the younger was wearing black shoes, as was the custom of mourners. Now, what's this custom? So in fact, the general practice is to wear black shoes, and it's a Mishnah in Beitza 15a. So Eliezer was different, that the laces of his shoes were black, while other people had white laces. So it can either be interpreted that other people wore white shoes and he wore black, or if they wore black shoes, they wore white laces and he wore only black. And that's according to Tosfot. But in any case, he looked very different to everybody else. So they basically asked him, because he was standing in the marketplace of Nahadia, and the officers of the house of the exile ark, which was basically the court-appointed sheriff in Babylon, so they found him dressed, and they said to him, look, why are you dressed like that? In other words, what's so different about you that justifies you wearing these shoes? These are shoes that were reserved for mourners. And he answered them, I'm mourning over the destruction of Jerusalem. So they asked him, are you important enough to mourn over Jerusalem? So I didn't actually know what that meant, because I thought we all mourn over Jerusalem. But apparently only Torah scholars are qualified to mourn constantly over the destruction of Jerusalem. In other words, it wasn't a day when everybody else was mourning, and the source of it was Kohelet chapter 1 verse 18. He increases knowledge of Torah, increases anguish over Jerusalem. So Torah scholars and people that have reached a certain level of notoriety in Torah learning perceive the loss of the temple more keenly than others. That's according to the Meiri Pesachim 54b. But in other words, other people have to fit within the standard established practices of halacha by the sages. So what do they do today? If you know today that if you go to some people's from homes, they actually don't plaster a certain portion of their wall.
Yeah.
So you see raw bricks. The problem is that today we live in the northern suburbs of Glen Hazel, where people think it's an eyesore, so they want to make it look like a decoration, like some avant-garde art, which in fact is detracting from the purpose. You can't make it look like a an art piece. You've got to make it look like it was an unfinished product to show today we still mourning for the temple lost. Anyway, when they said to him, what are you dressed like this for? This is only reserved on a daily basis for people that are holding at a level of notoriety in the Torah learning. He said, I'm mourning over the destruction of Jerusalem. And they said, are you important enough to mourn over Jerusalem to dress like this every day, sort of thing? So they thought it was an exhibition of arrogance, of haughtiness. So basically, you're not allowed to, unless you have a reputation of being a Talmud Chacham, or a pious person, to conspicuously adopt any of the practices of the Chachamim. That's in Brocha 17b, like dressing like that in every day. So what did they do in every democratic society? They put him in prison. Okay. So he said to them, I'm a great man, meaning I'm actually great in my Torah study. And they said to him, all right, like we don't want to keep you in prison anymore. So how would we know this? So he said, look, I tell you what, let's make a deal, because I actually would like to see sunset out of my prison cell. It's not a bad thing. So he said, I tell you what, you've got two choices here. Either you ask me something and I'll answer you, or alternatively, I will ask you something that you'll be unable to answer. Now, what do you think would be more intriguing for the guys? Questioning him.
Him questioning the authorities, or the authorities questioning him?
No, so basically they wanted to throw him in jail because he can't dress like somebody pretending to be one of the leaders. Okay, and could dress like they were in mourning every day for the destruction of the temple. And they said, who are you trying to kid? You're being arrogant. You know, you're not allowed to do like this. It's reserved for special people, so they threw him in jail. And then they kind of felt that they didn't want to necessarily throw him in jail when he said, listen, I'm a great Torah person. So they said, all right, while you're here, you want to get yourself out of here. I want to get you out of here. Let's kind of prove it. He said, so cool. There's two ways we can prove it, he said. Either you ask me anything, and if I can't answer it, you leave me in jail. Or alternatively, I ask you something, and if you can't answer it, you free me. So they took him off to one of the sages that knew obviously a great deal, and they were curious to see if there was something he could ask one of the sages that he would not know. Because from a curiosity point of view, it's much easier than stubbing the questioner. It's to stub the person that really knows what's going on. So they took him up on that offer. He offered them both. So what did he say? He said, look, I want to ask you something. A person who cuts down another's budding dates, what does he pay? In other words, the stage of budding dates, sorry, I've got a tongue twister. Budding dates. Yeah. Dubbing gates. No, I'm on heroin.
Flooding gates. Flooding gates.
Flooding gates. Flooding gates? Budding grapes. Or something.
Budding grapes.
Exactly. Yeah. So we're talking here about budding dates. It's the equivalent of boser, which is budding grapes. Okay? Either way, he's saying, look, if they had that state, now you can understand I would stay in jail because I can barely talk. So anyway, so he asked one of the sages, a person who cuts down another's budding dates, what does he pay? And they answered him, he pays the value of budding dates. In other words, they're not worth anything if they were sold in their current state. So therefore, they sold in their current state because that's the stage at which he picked them. Okay? So he retorted, but they will eventually become ripe dates. So what's his point? His point is the damager has failed to compensate the victim for his loss. Because had the damager waited, the damaged party would get full value on his ripened produce. So he's saying we've got a bit of a problem here. So they said, well, okay, if that's the case, they will so pay the value of the ripe dates. He said, well, that's not a solution because he didn't take ripe dates from the owner, meaning that he shouldn't have to pay for more than the damage he actually caused. And this is an objection that could have been raised against any of this Tanaim who required one who's damaged budding figs or grapes to pay their full value, so they had already ripened. So this is a question that's brought now because it's a question that you should ask. Either way, you're going to have an unhappy person, either the damager or the damaged. Because if you pay at the budding stage, the damaged party has lost out. If you pay at the ripened stage, the damager is paying more than he has to because it's at the budding stage. So what do? That's the question. So they said, okay, you want to get out of jail, you answer us. So he said that Eliezer the younger said the damage is evaluated in relation to a field 60 times larger than the damaged area. Okay, in other words, the damager doesn't pay the worth of the dates themselves, whether ripe or unripe. Rather, he pays how much he reduced the value of the field at the moment of the damage, when the dates were unripe. Now, okay, so we understand this so far. So what's the chak? So when a person buys a field whose fruit is still unripe, he realizes that it will probably increase in value, and he pays accordingly. Hence, the price of such a field, as well as any reduction in the price due to the damage, reflects its potential growth. Under this method, therefore, the damager compensates the victim for his current loss in a way that reflects the fruit's future value. That's brought by Rashi and the Ravad. So do you understand how you get a balance of both? Let me just explain it to you. Is that if you pick it at this current stage, either the damager is going to overpay because they're not ripe, or the damaged part is going to take a loss because they could have ripened. So how do you fix that? So he's saying that's why you have to evaluate it in a field of 1 in 60, because the loss is going to be mitigated by the damaged party, and the damager isn't going to pay more than he should, because who's ever looking in the field in a greater context will see that everything else will eventually have potential value of ripening. So therefore, the damager doesn't overpay, but the damaged party gets the value of ripe produce, because we can either assess and say, like one of the opinions, obviously, like Rav Yossi Aklili say, we wait for the field to mature, and then we see what the ripe produce would have gotten. So in other words, he sold the property minus the damaged area, and whatever the ripe produce would have gotten in terms of the greater field context, the damager would pay. So he's not paying for the market value of just what he damaged, because that would be exorbitantly high. In other words, it's a nice balance between the two. That's why you take it in the context of a larger land, because you can see how it's going to turn out. So in other words, even if somebody buys it prematurely, they're still buying it based on the fact that it's going to come to fruition, no pun intended, kid, and he's going to get better value. So it's a nice way of paying the damaged party as well as the damager not overpaying. But if you take it just within the context of what was damaged, there's just misery all around. You're not getting paid on potential for the current value. Any questions, guys, before we proceed?
Thanks.
Arth, any questions? All right, so let's just carry on. Rabbi Shimon said so this is going to be a bit of a contradiction, and in a way not, because if his animal ate ripe produce, he pays the value of the produce itself, not the depreciation of land. So we're saying, but hang on a second, we were talking about the fact that, by the way, before we get to Rabbi Shimon, I just wanted to let you know how the story ended. So when he said, this is how we see it in relation to a field 60 times larger, they asked him, who said this to you? And he answered them, while Shmuel is alive and his court is in existence. So basically, he said, look, they need to corroborate with Shmuel to find out that he was a student of theirs and that the answer was, in fact, correct. So they sent a query to Shmuel, and Shmuel responded to him. Eliezer argued correctly to you when he said that the damage is evaluated in relation to a field 60 times larger than the damaged area. And then they released him. So he got out of jail. Okay. So now we're going on to an issue of Rabbi Shimon, which was the end of the Mishnah in 55b, where Rabbi Shimon said if his animal ate ripe produce, he pays the value of the produce itself, not the depreciation of the land. So the Gemara says, well, basically, what's the reason for it? Because the reason why we're saying what's the reason for it is because it seems to contradict the verse in Shmot, Exodus chapter 22, verse 4, and it consumes in the field of another. Because we learned the word in the field of another, it's seen in the greater context of surrounding fields. Does that make sense? So we're wanting to know why Rabbi Shimon said it's only checked within the produce in and of itself when it's ripe. It seems like a contradiction. And it's not, because in regard to that which the merciful one stated in his Torah, and it consumes in the field of another, this teaches that we evaluate damaged projects in the context of the field, but those words only apply to produce that still needs the field. So what do we mean? If it's not ready to be harvested and the produce was unripe, it would be unfair for the damager to make him pay as though it had already ripened, because the future growth is not guaranteed. A lot of circumstances could come up to prevent it from reaching maturity. Plague, pestilence, insects, drought. So instead, the damage is assessed as a reduction of the land's current value. If, however, the damage was done to ripe produce, it would be unfair to the damaged party to receive less than its full worth, which is the price after it had been picked. So what's the criteria here is that they no longer need the field, then they cease to be part of the field. So what do we mean? In the case of these ripe fruits, which are subjects of Rabbi Shimon's ruling, since they no longer need the field, the damager must pay for them on their own. In other words, if they've ripened, it means they don't need the earth to grow anymore. And therefore, they're going to reach full value. So you can't get the leniency then of 1 in 60, because it's not dependent on the land for future growth. And you damage ripe produce, so it's only fair the damager pays it. You only pay in relation of 1 in 60 when it's still in its developmental stage and needs the earth. Okay? So the Tana Kamma of our Mishnah disagrees with Rabbi Shimon. Well, how do you know? Because in his view, even damage to ripe produce is evaluated in the context of the field. Because why? The Tana interprets the verse and it consumes in the field of another as even ripe produce. So he's saying the minute you've got something from the Chumash, it's overall. And it's the same whether it's ripe or unripe, anything like that. It's still taken in that context. It doesn't matter the situation. So the Tana Kamma, the person that wrote the Mishnah, is different to Rabbi Shimon. That's why I quoted Rabbi Shimon at the end as a dissenting view. Okay, so now we need to know the halacha. So the Gemara decides the law. Rav Huna bar Chia said in the name of Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba, Rav ruled in accordance with Rabbi Meir in a different case. Okay. Now you always got to know, why is it mentioning this in a different case? It's basically, there's only 2 cases where Rav went with the minority opinion. Okay, so we're going to learn these 2 cases now. In other words, generally when you learn Rav, he goes with the majority of opinion. These are the 2 cases he goes with the minority of opinion. In other words, he goes with Rabbi Shimon on this. Why? Is because because in the case of the Mishnah, just hang on a sec, Rav Huna bar Chia said in the name of Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba, Rav ruled in accordance with Rabbi Meir in a different case. And he established the halacha in accordance with Rabbi Shimon in our Mishnah. So the second part of the statement is explained, and he established the halacha in accordance with Rabbi Shimon. These words pertain to the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, which we learned in our Mishnah, that if an animal ate ripe produce, the owner pays the value of ripe produce. That if the volume of the consumed produce was a se'ah, he pays for a se'ah. And if it's 2 se'ah, he pays 2 se'ahs. So Rav is agreeing with Rabbi Shimon in this case, is that when it no longer needs the field, that you have to take the ripe fruit as though it's ready to be harvested. Whereas the majority of the opinion and the Tana Kamma was saying it's still connected to 1/60 of the land. Now, we're learning another case in which Rav went with Rabbi Meir, who was a minority opinion. So we're going to do this case now. Rav ruled in accordance with Rabbi Meir. This refers to Rabbi Meir's opinion that is taught in the following brisa, which speaks of a husband who sold 2 fields during his marriage. Okay, so now we're dealing with the laws of ketubah, which is the payment a woman collects from her husband or his estate. Obviously, his estate, if he precedes her in death, he predeceases her, so to speak. Guys, there's a lot of shuffling. Which computer is coming from? So I can just put it on mute.
I think that's Arthur.
Okay, no problem, mate. All right, so what we're saying is, look, there's 2 ways that a woman gets her ketubah. Either the husband dies, and she outlives him, and he predeceases her. Then she collects from his estate. Other than that, she collects from the divorce settlement when they go through getting a divorce, okay? But when a man marries, all of his property becomes mortgaged to his wife's ketubah. So should he die or divorce his wife and leave no property from which to collect the ketubah, she's authorized to seize properties that he sold or gave away during their marriage. That's in Subot 51a. Now, you should remember something. There were certain circumstances with regards to this, because we dealt about this in certain dafs before. I'm sure you guys remember. So, basically, the husband's got 2 fields. He sold 2 fields during their marriage. So he wrote a deed selling the first field to the first buyer, and his wife did not sign for him. She didn't authorize it in front of witnesses. She didn't sign for him. And then he wrote a deed selling the second field to a second buyer, and in this case, his wife did sign for him an agreement, okay, or agreed verbally in front of witnesses. But it's saying here that according to Rabbi Meir, she's lost her ketubah. In other words, if there are no fields, other fields to which she can't collect, because she can't collect from either of these buyers. So unless the husband's got other property stashed away, she can't collect from either of these buyers. Now, we did address this. Do you guys remember why?
Well, firstly, he can't have another property stash somewhere. It's unlikely because of the fact that she signed the last one. So she wouldn't have had to sign the last one if he had more properties.
Correct.
There's no need to get her signature then.
Correct, 100%. So, but we did learn the principle. So I think, guys, we learned this definitely in the 9th daf, because I remember learning it in the call with Rabbi Cohen. So what we learned is, if you remember, obviously she can't collect from the second buyer. I mean, that goes without saying, because she relinquished her rights to it. She added her signature to approve the deed of sale. That's not the issue. The issue was the first buyer. She can't collect from his field because when he bought it, there was still an unsold property for the second field in the husband's possession. So in other words, we learned that when the first buyer buys a property, if he hasn't done his due diligence and he hasn't found out if this guy's married, and there's no other field available for her, she has first right to collect back that field from him. It's only when there's a second field available that he can tell her as the buyer to go collect from the available field. Does that make sense?
Yep.
In other words, Gavin, if there's no field available, that belongs to the wife. The husband can't sell something that is jointly owned by both parties without a signature. So therefore, if he does so, then the buyer can lose the property if the wife divorces her husband and claims the property back. So the only way that he can do due diligence at the time is if there was another property available, that there can be testimony to it, that he makes the husband sign, that would be renegated to his wife, so that he bought it in good conscience. Then she doesn't have a lien on that first property if there's a second property, even if it's in a ketubah. Because as long as there's another property to collect from, because again, guys, there were two opinions. The one is there's a lien on that exact property, and the other opinion is there was a lien on that value of land. So according to the opinion that there was a lien on that exact property, there's no issue that the buyer wouldn't be able to attach it because there's a lien on that specific property. But according to the opinion that a lien is just on that value's worth of property, then it could be collected from any field should he die or divorce her. So according to that second opinion, where it's not a lien on a specific property but merely on value, as long as there's another field available to her, the buyer has not acted negligently without due diligence. So as long as there was a second field, and then the second field is sold with the woman's consent, she can't go back to the buyer of the first property and say, I want my property back. We'll say, no, hang on a second. At the time when we did this transaction, there was another field available for you. What happened subsequently is not my problem. It's your problem. I bought it in clear conscience. So she can't go back to the first buyer. And she can't go to the second one because when she signed the ketubah, she relinquished her right to it. So then there's an argument, and that argument is as follows. Is that Rabbi Yehuda said she's able to say, I did this, in other words, consented to the second sale, only to please my husband. What claims do you have against me? So in other words, he's saying the wife's got a good defense, Rabbi Yehuda, because she can assert that she relinquished her rights to the second field, only so that her husband wouldn't become angry with her. Because unless she waives her rights, he's either not going to sell it or not obtain full value because it could be taken back. So since her waiver was not wholehearted, she retains the right to that field and its sale is deemed invalid. Now, Rabbi Meir rejects that claim because if the wife was intent on pleasing her husband, she would have agreed to the first sale as well. It's clear, therefore, that the relinquishment of her right to the second field was sincere. Now, I've got a problem with this. It's a question on Rabbi Meir. This is my question. Say the wife said to the husband, listen, that first property was in the ketubah. I'm not happy about you selling it. It's in the ketubah. He said, babe, that property was in Yovel when we first got married. Yovel is worthless now. The second property that I've just bought is in Glen Hazel. It's worth something. I'm going to sell the first property. The second property is available for us in Glen Hazel. So I think the wife could turn around and be okay with selling the first property to the husband, even though he didn't need her consent necessarily. And by the way, I don't know why I didn't need her consent if it's part of the ketubah. But if she's got two properties, let's say that property wasn't in the ketubah. I still don't understand why that would be not a fair argument, because the fair argument just states that if the wife thought there was another property due, there's no reason that she would have any issue about allowing him to sell the first property. Does that make sense to a buyer? Because she knows she can't claim it back. But if there's a second property, what would she mind if it's in a better area? So I'm not quite sure I understand that part. Okay?
But I understood it that way, that when I read it on Saturday, what you're saying now is that as long as there's a second property, she should be fine with that because of the fact that there is a second property. Because in the ketubah, it's not specific, eh? It's not specific. It's, you need to, if you in the ketubah say a third quality property land, that's all you need to give her. Any type
Okay,
of
but
third
that's
property.
not according to Rashi, because Rashi states that the first sale was a field that was designated for her ketubah. I checked this.
Did it say that?
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
and
Okay. I didn't see that wording.
It says
Okay.
such a field belongs to 3 types of properties on which the wife relies, more than any others for payment of a ketubah. They are land that the husband designated for the ketubah, which was recorded as such in the ketubah document, land he designated orally in the presence of witnesses for that purposes, and land that the woman brought into the marriage as a son Bazel property. That's in Bava Basra 49b.
Yeah, I saw
Okay,
that.
but
Yeah.
you can find it in note number 23 if you look. Okay, so then the brisa can be understood as follows, okay, is that a wife can prevent her husband from selling any of the properties. Should he sell one without her consent, the sale would be declared void. But if she does consent to the sale, she relinquishes her lien on the properties and may no longer collect her ketubah. So that's in contrast with the other fields, which she can sell without her agreement. So that's what I'm not quite sure I understood. But the brisa can be understood as follows. You could say that the husband attempted to sell one of the 3 properties, and his wife didn't give her consent. So the sale was invalid, and the field reverted to the husband's ownership. He then sold the same field to a second purchaser. Now we're talking about the same field. Then it makes sense. This time with his wife's permission. So if the husband has no other fields from which he can collect, she's lost her ketubah. So according to Rabbeinu Yonasan, we're not talking about 2 separate fields here. We're talking about the same field with 2 separate buyers. First time she didn't consent, second time she did. And the second time she did, she relinquished it even though it was in a ketubah. And that makes more sense. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, guys, we're done. I told you we would keep under 40 minutes. We've got 5.5 minutes left. I'm happy to do so.